Welcome back to the Journeyman Podcast. This is episode 55, and boy, do we have a topic for you all today.
We do. We've got a really interesting one.
Yeah, buckle up for this one.
Absolutely.
If you've flown commercially in the U.S. anytime recently, you might have had a little thought in the back of your mind that maybe things aren't quite as safe as they used to be. I know I have.
Right. I think a lot of people are thinking that these days.
It's a feeling I can't quite shake, and it seems like a lot of other folks are out there feeling the same way. So today, we're going deep on this. We're doing a deep dive into some serious concerns about the state of U.S. air travel safety. And all this comes from a recent interview with a veteran commercial airline pilot that really got us thinking. If you're enjoying this deep dive so far, please do us a favor, hit that like button, and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives like this.
Yeah, so we'll be breaking down this interview with Captain Sherry Walker. She's been flying commercially since 1991. That's almost 35 years in the air. Yeah, she's got a lot of experience. And what's even more interesting is she's also a college professor who teaches human factors. So she's got a really unique perspective on all of this.
Definitely a multifaceted view.
Absolutely. And this interview was with Tucker Carlson back on October 26, 2024. And she brings up some really important questions about where the airline industry is headed.
So our goal today is to really unpack this interview for you. We'll be looking at a whole bunch of things like how priorities are changing at the corporate level, the impact of hiring practices, the critical role of pilot experience, and of course, how regulatory bodies are handling all of this. And by the way, if you're interested in checking out the full interview yourself, we've got a link down in the description.
Be sure to also check out the Tucker Carlson channel for more great interviews like this.
Now, one of the big things Captain Walker talks about is this fundamental shift she sees happening in airline corporations. And it's being driven by what's known as ESG principles, which stands for environmental, social, and governance. She argues that this shift is actually having a negative impact on airlines, maybe even at the cost of customers and employees.
What's fascinating is how different this is from the old school philosophy of people like Gordon Bethune over at Continental and, of course, Herb Kelleher at Southwest. Their approach was all about taking care of your employees, and in turn, they'll take care of your customers.
Right. A happy employee means happy customers. It's all about that internal culture.
Exactly.
But Captain Walker seems to think that this whole philosophy has been replaced by a laser focus on the bottom line and making those shareholders happy. And that often means expanding rapidly. She even mentions people like Larry Fink. She kind of suggests that ESG considerations might not always be about what's best for the airline or the passengers, but instead, it's about keeping those investors satisfied and meeting certain external criteria.
And, when you think about your own experiences flying, have you noticed any changes? Maybe customer service isn't what it used to be, or you're dealing with more delays. It makes you wonder if these corporate priorities are playing a role.
I've definitely noticed a few things here and there.
Yeah.
Another big concern that Captain Walker brings up, and she's pretty vocal about this one, is the impact of DEI initiatives, that's diversity, equity, and inclusion, on pilot hiring.
This is where it gets interesting.
Oh yeah, she doesn't hold back.
No, she doesn't. So she talks about this airline CEO who back in 2021 set a goal of having 50% of new pilot hires be women or people of color.
50%, huh?
Yeah, that was the goal. And Captain Walker basically calls this an impossible target, and she's worried that when you start prioritizing things other than qualifications and merit, it could really affect the overall competence of your pilots.
And let's not forget, Captain Walker herself is a woman who's been flying commercially for a long time.
Right, she's been there, done that.
She really stresses that she earned her spot through hard work and dedication, just like any of her male colleagues. She sees herself as one of the guys, an airman, in the truest sense. For her, qualifications are everything.
And it leads into another point she makes about how passengers might now start to question the qualifications of female and minority pilots and whether they got hired based on their skills or just to meet some quota. She's worried that this whole DEI push might actually end up hurting the very people it's supposed to help. In her words, they're wondering how we got our jobs. Yes, that is absolutely right. D hurts those that weren't a product of it as well, and that's unfair to me and to my coworkers.
It's a really interesting point. And she also tells this story about a DEI training session at her airline that's pretty wild. They asked her to confirm that a biological male who identifies as a woman has always been a woman. And well, she refused. She cited her faith as the reason.
I can see why that would be a tough one.
Yeah, and her point is that these kinds of exercises are just distractions from what really matters in the cockpit. Safety and being able to do your job well. Her words were, what matters is how to fly and approach. Do you know the regulations? Are you safe? Right? This other stuff is distracting. And it's distracting at the FAA as well. It's about keeping the focus on what's truly important.
Makes sense.
And to really drive home the point about natural aptitude, she talks about this female student she was trying to teach to fly. Now, the student could handle the controls, but Captain Walker felt like she lacked that certain aggression and assertiveness you sometimes need to handle a plane in tough situations. Sometimes you need to be able to take charge.
Oh, absolutely. You
Now,
can't hesitate up there.
exactly. So her point is that certain personality traits are just as important as technical skills when it comes to being a good pilot.
So basically, what Captain Walker is advocating for is a hiring system that's purely based on merit and qualifications. She's not about excluding anyone, but she wants to make sure that every single pilot who steps into that cockpit is the best of the best, regardless of their background.
Couldn't agree more. Now let's talk about another thing that Captain Walker is concerned about, and that's the generational shifts she's seeing among pilots. She's worried about the overall experience level going down.
Yeah, she notices some differences in the newer generation of pilots. They seem to be more focused on the financial rewards of the job, which is understandable. It's a good living.
Yep.
But maybe they don't have the same sense of responsibility or commitment that pilots used to have.
Like that sense of entitlement that some people talk about.
Right. And she also points out how pilots used to learn on those old stick and rudder planes. You know, the ones that really forced you to master those basic flying skills?
Ah, the good old days.
Exactly. But now most pilots are trained on those fancy glass cockpits, which are super high-tech and automated. So they're becoming more like operators who rely heavily on computers.
Which makes you wonder what happens if those systems fail. Like in that famous United Airlines Flight 232 crash in Sioux City, the pilot, Captain Al Haynes, and his crew, they really had to rely on their basic flying skills to land that plane after they lost all hydraulics.
It was an incredible feat of airmanship.
It really was. And Captain Walker's point is that a lot of today's pilots might not have those same skills. She says that skill's not there and it takes time to build that skill. And then there's the issue of how quickly some pilots are becoming captains these days.
Yeah, that's a big one.
She's like, we've got pilots now that are coming in at minimum skills, having learned on glass cockpits, and in a year, upgrade to captain. It's a far cry from her own experience where she spent 12 years working her way up, observing different aspects of airline operations before finally becoming a captain.
It really makes you think about the level of experience those newer captains have.
It does. And she also mentions how some of these younger pilots will call in fatigued right before a flight. Like, oh, I can't fly, I'm too tired. She kind of chalks it up to them being new to the whole adulting thing,
Yeah.
Green at life, not just at piloting. It's like they haven't quite grasped the level of commitment that comes with this job.
So it's not just about having the technical skills, it's about having the maturity and the responsibility that goes along with being a pilot.
Absolutely. Now let's turn our attention to the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration. Captain Walker has some strong opinions about how they're doing things.
She's not shy about sharing her thoughts.
Definitely not. One of her big criticisms is this dual mandate that the FAA has. They're supposed to both regulate air travel safety and promote the growth of the aviation industry. Captain Walker sees that as a conflict of interest.
It's like trying to serve two masters.
Exactly. She brings up the example of Boeing and the 737 or CAS. She questions how Boeing was allowed to essentially self-certify the plane, meaning they got to say it was safe, without the FAA doing a thorough independent check from the get-go. Of course, after those 737 and RAX crashes, they changed things up a bit.
Yeah, that raised some serious red flags.
It did. And Captain Walker kind of suggests that this whole push to promote the industry might sometimes lead to the FAA being a bit lax on the safety regulations. She even points out that a lot of aviation safety rules are written in blood. They come about after something bad has already happened. It's a reactive approach instead of a proactive one.
It's a sobering thought.
It is. And she does have some hopes for the new FAA administrator, but she's also worried that there might be some resistance to change within the agency. That old bureaucracy can be tough to shake up.
So it raises the question of whether safety is truly the FAA's top priority, or if they're more concerned with keeping the industry happy.
And then Captain Walker brings up some recent incidents that have really made her worry about the current state of safety.
Yeah, those were pretty concerning.
She talks about that near collision we had near DCA Reagan National Airport, where a commercial plane and a helicopter almost hit each other. She calls the airspace design in that area reckless and crazy, especially those super close separation distances. They have like just 75 feet apart in some cases. She was actually quite shocked when she heard the details during the NTSB press conference.
75 feet. That's cutting it close.
Way too close for comfort. And she also mentions that plane that had a hard landing and rolled over in Toronto. She thinks that the pilots might have lost situational awareness, maybe because of the bad weather. It just goes to show how things can go wrong even with experienced pilots.
Yeah, it's a reminder that there are so many factors that can contribute to an incident.
So many things have to go right to make sure a flight is safe. Now let's get into a really important but sensitive topic that Captain Walker discusses, and that's pilot mental health and the medical certification process, especially for transgender pilots.
This is a really complex issue with a lot of different angles.
It is. Captain Walker acknowledges that pilot mental health is super important, and she mentions that there have been pilot suicides in the past. But her main focus here is on the FAA's rules for certifying transgender pilots.
Yeah, she goes into some detail about that.
She explains that after some lobbying efforts back around 2012 and 2016, the FAA relaxed the psychological testing requirements for transgender pilots, especially those who had been transitioning or on hormone therapy for 5 years or more.
So they eased up on the testing.
They did. And what's interesting, or maybe even worrying, are the statistics that she brings up. She talks about this National Transgender Survey from 2015 that showed higher rates of mental health issues and suicide attempts among transgender people. And she questions why the FAA didn't really consider this data when they changed their policies.
It's a valid question.
It is. And then she mentions this other study from 2020 and 2023 that supposedly found an 80 to 90% increase in the risk of things like blood clots, heart attacks, and strokes in biological males who are transitioning to female and taking hormone replacement therapy. She basically says, look, the FAA is usually super cautious about anything that could cause a pilot to become incapacitated during flight. So why are they allowing pilots with these potentially increased risks to fly?
That's a really good point. It seems like there might be a disconnect there.
It does. And then she also talks about how the list of drugs that pilots aren't allowed to take is kept secret. Only aviation medical examiners have access to it.
Really? I had no idea.
Yeah, it's kind of strange.
Mhm.
And of course, it makes some pilots nervous because they want to make sure they're following all the rules, but they don't even know what all the rules are.
That's not very transparent.
Not at all. And then she brings up something that really got our attention. She's concerned about how quickly the COVID-19 vaccines were approved for pilots.
Oh, yeah, that was a whirlwind.
It was. She says the then federal air surgeon, Dr. Michael Berry, gave the green light for pilots to get vaccinated just one day after the FDA issued that emergency use authorization. And then, get this, he retired a week later and took a job with a pilot insurance company.
Wow, that's a pretty quick turnaround.
It is, and it raises some questions about whether he was maybe influenced by that future job opportunity. And then there's the whole issue of the EUA status of the vaccine and how it hadn't been fully tested for the unique conditions that pilots face, flying at high altitude with changes in cabin pressure.
Yeah, that's definitely something to think about. It's not like your average work environment up there.
Not at all. Now let's talk about another really controversial topic that Captain Walker experienced firsthand, the COVID-19 vaccine mandate at her airline.
This was a huge deal for a lot of pilots.
It was. So in August of 2021, Captain Walker's airline announces this vaccine mandate. All employees have to get vaccinated within a month or they're fired.
Wow, talk about pressure.
Seriously. And Captain Walker, she refuses to get vaccinated. She has religious objections because of the use of aborted fetal tissue in the development or production of the vaccines. And she wasn't alone. About 2,000 other employees at her airline also refused.
2,000 employees. That's a lot of people taking a stand.
It is. And they faced a ton of pressure and even threats. They were told they could lose their 401k or retirement savings. Captain Walker says the airline's process for getting a religious exemption was a nightmare. She calls it onerous and corrupt. And she feels like they were trying to make unvaccinated employees feel like outcasts.
It sounds like a really toxic environment.
It was rough. But these employees, they didn't back down. They got organized, hired lawyers, and filed a lawsuit to try to block the mandate. And while they lost at first, they ended up winning in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, and they were allowed to come back to work. But this was after 4 months of being on unpaid leave.
That must have been incredibly difficult for them.
It was a huge financial burden. And even after they returned, Captain Walker says they still face some retaliation and bureaucratic roadblocks. But she has so much respect for those 2,000 employees who held their ground. She calls them heroes.
It's a testament to their conviction.
It really is.
Yeah.
Now, Captain Walker also has some things to say about her union, the Airline Pilots Association, ALPA, and how they handled this whole vaccine mandate situation.
Yeah, she doesn't hold back on her criticism.
Yeah, she says that ALPA basically abandoned them during the mandate. They didn't do enough to support their members who are facing getting fired. And she also thinks the ALPA is actually making the pilot shortage worse by not supporting efforts to raise the mandatory retirement age for pilots.
So she's not happy with how the union is operating.
Not at all. She also feels like ALPA is getting too focused on things that aren't really core union issues. She brings up this DEI committee they have that's supposedly run by a transgender pilot who even tells people what words they can and can't use.
That seems a bit excessive.
It does. And Captain Walker thinks the union should be focusing on things like pay, job security, working conditions, the stuff that really matters to pilots. She even goes so far as to call the union the tick on the dog, meaning they're too cozy with airline management and not looking out for the pilots they represent.
So there's a real sense of distrust there.
Big time. Let's shift gears now and talk about something else that Captain Walker touches on, the demographics and temperament of airline pilots.
She's got some interesting observations about that.
Yeah, she's noticed that pilots tend to reflect the political leanings of the areas where they're based, but she also thinks that the nature of the job, being so technical and science-driven, attracts people who are logical and analytical.
You got to be able to think clearly under pressure.
Absolutely. But here's the thing. She's worried about what she calls irrational beliefs. She specifically mentions gender identity and how it could potentially affect a pilot's judgment and decision-making in the cockpit.
That's a pretty bold statement.
It is. And she tells this story about a transgender captain she flew with in the past, who she didn't think was a very competent pilot. She kind of implies that maybe this captain's personal issues were interfering with their ability to fly safely.
That's concerning.
She even mentions how some pilots are now hesitant to leave the cockpit during those required breaks on long flights because they're not sure about the skills or focus of the other pilots who are taking over. So there's this sense of mistrust creeping in.
Yeah, that's not a good sign. Trust is so important in a cockpit.
It really is, especially on those long flights where fatigue and teamwork are crucial. Finally, let's touch on Captain Walker's thoughts about the future of aviation technology.
She's got some strong feelings about where things are headed.
Yeah, she's not thrilled about this whole push toward single pilot or even pilotless planes.
Autonomous flight, huh?
Exactly. She makes it very clear, I'm not getting in an airplane without a pilot. She just doesn't trust those systems to handle every possible situation, especially when you're talking about carrying passengers.
So she's a firm believer in the human element.
She is. She thinks that pilots with their years of experience and intuition are still essential for safe air travel. She acknowledges that drones and other autonomous systems have come a long way, but she doesn't think they're ready for prime time when it comes to commercial flights.
So basically, Captain Walker is sounding the alarm about a lot of different things. She sees corporate greed, DEI over merit, a decline in pilot experience, a questionable FAA, and a union that's not doing enough to protect its members. It paints a pretty bleak picture of the state of U.S. aviation.
It's a lot to take in, for sure. So for our listeners, what's the key takeaway here? What's the big message that Captain Walker is trying to get across?
I think the main thing is that she's warning us that all of these different factors combined could be putting air travel safety at risk. She wants us to think critically about what's happening in the airline industry and not just assume that everything is fine.
It's a call to action for sure. And here's something for everyone to ponder. As technology advances and social values change, how do we make sure that safety, competence, and experience remain the top priorities in aviation? How do we make sure that those things don't get pushed aside for profit or politics?
That's a big question. And if you're interested in hearing more from Captain Walker herself, be sure to check out the link to her full interview down in the description. And while you're at it, head over to the Tucker Carlson channel and subscribe for more thought-provoking interviews like this one.
And if you enjoy this deep dive into the state of air travel safety, please hit that like button and subscribe to the Journeyman podcast for more deep dives like this one. Thanks for joining us.